30 years in law enforcement. I worked homicides, missing persons, cold cases. I interviewed killers. I sat across from men who did unspeakable things. And in all that time, the cases that stayed with me, the ones I still think about when I'm trying to sleep, weren't the murders. They were the ones where someone survived. Not because survival is easy, because it is the hardest thing a human being can do. There's a particular kind of evil in captivity. It doesn't announce itself with a weapon every morning. It works slowly. It rewires the brain of the person trapped inside it. It makes them believe that what is happening to them is somehow their fault, or their destiny, or the only reality that exists. And then, if that person is lucky, if they are extraordinary, one day a window opens, a pizza box shows up, and they take it. I want to tell you about what it actually means to survive 11 years in a basement. Not the headlines, not the 2-paragraph summary. The real thing, the psychology, the mechanics, the moment when a human being decides that today is the day, and they write 4 words on a cardboard box, and they hand that box to a stranger, and they pray. Because understanding this case means understanding something about how captivity actually works. And understanding how it works is the only way we ever stop it from happening. When I was at NYPD, early in my career, I caught my first missing persons case involving long-term captivity. The victim had been missing 18 months. When we found her, the first thing she said to me wasn't, "Help me." It wasn't, "Thank you." She said, "He's going to be so angry." 18 months later, and her first thought was about protecting her captor from consequences. That moment never left me. I needed to understand why. And over the next 20 years, working cases in Chicago, I learned. The human mind under sustained coercive control doesn't behave the way outsiders expect. It adapts. It finds ways to survive inside an impossible situation. And sometimes that adaptation looks, from the outside, like cooperation. Let me be clear about something before we go further. When a victim doesn't run at the first opportunity, when they seem compliant, when they don't scream for help the moment someone comes to the door, that is not evidence that they weren't really a victim. That is evidence that the captor did exactly what captors do. Isolation, psychological control, fear, intermittent reinforcement. These are not random tactics. They are calculated. They work. Coercive control is a system. It doesn't require chains on a wall, though sometimes there are chains. It requires complete isolation from anyone who might help. It requires controlling every resource: food, water, sleep, light. It requires convincing the victim that the outside world is either unreachable or unwilling to help. And it requires the constant threat of consequences, not always violence. Sometimes just the look, the tone, the reminder that he knows where her family lives. In the case we're talking about today, the woman, I'll call her Sarah, because her name and the specific jurisdiction have not been made fully public, and I respect that, was a young woman who was taken under circumstances that began with someone she trusted. That is, statistically speaking, how these cases almost always begin. The stranger in the van is the nightmare we warn children about, but the data tells a different story. Most long-term captivity cases begin with a person the victim knew, a boyfriend, a family friend, an employer, someone who had already established trust before they began to establish control. The transition from relationship to captivity is almost never a single dramatic moment. It is a series of incremental steps. The first time he locks the door, there is an explanation. The first time she isn't allowed to call her mother, there is a reason that almost makes sense. The first time she realizes she doesn't know where her phone is, she tells herself she must have misplaced it. By the time the full architecture of her imprisonment is in place, she has been conditioned to accept each individual component. She never saw the whole structure being built. She was inside it before she understood what it was. 11 years is not an abstract number. I want you to sit with that for a moment. 11 years is roughly 4,000 days. 4,000 mornings waking up in the same basement. 4,000 nights listening to footsteps on the floor above. It is long enough to forget what freedom feels like in your body. long enough that the world outside changes so dramatically that it starts to feel like a foreign country, long enough that the people who might look for you have, some of them, stopped looking. The psychological literature on long-term captivity describes something called learned helplessness. It was identified first in laboratory research and then recognized in survivor populations, from concentration camps, from prisoners of war, from cult survivors. The mechanism is this: when a person is subjected to repeated, painful, or controlling events that they cannot influence or escape, they stop trying to escape, even when an escape becomes possible. Their nervous system has learned, at a very deep level, that their actions don't change outcomes, so they stop acting. This is not weakness. I want to say that again. This is not weakness. It is a survival adaptation. It is the brain doing exactly what it is designed to do, which is to conserve energy and reduce risk under conditions of severe threat. The person who appears passive, who appears compliant, who doesn't run, that person's brain is doing something extraordinarily sophisticated. It is keeping them alive, day after day, in an environment where the wrong move means punishment or worse. But here's what I also know from 30 years of doing this work. The spirit doesn't die, even when the body stops fighting. Sarah kept that note in her head for years before she wrote it. She rehearsed scenarios. She watched the patterns of when he left, when he came back, who came to the door, how long deliveries took. She was doing what every investigator does, building a picture, identifying the opportunity, waiting for the moment when the risk-reward calculation finally shifted. The pizza delivery changed that calculation. I don't know exactly how many times a delivery person had come to that door over the years, probably dozens. But something about this particular delivery, on this particular day, felt different to her. Maybe he was running late from another errand. Maybe he had been drinking. Maybe she had simply reached a point, as survivors sometimes do, where the cost of staying had finally, definitively, outweighed the terror of trying to leave. She wrote the note in what had to be a matter of seconds. There was no time for a long message. There was no ability to explain 11 years in a few words on a cardboard box. What she wrote was a distress signal, a location, enough that a stranger, a young driver doing a pizza run, would understand that something was wrong. She slipped it to him when the exchange happened at the door. She watched him look at it. She watched his face change. If you have ever wondered what it means to bet your life on a stranger, that is it. That is the moment. She had no guarantee. She had no way of knowing if he would take it seriously or throw it away or even tell the man at the door. She handed over the only leverage she had, and she waited. Now, I want you to think about what she was doing in those seconds between handing him the note and watching him leave. Every worst-case scenario was running through her mind at full speed. Every version of what happens if he doesn't believe her. Every version of what happens if he comes back and tells. She had spent 11 years managing exactly this kind of fear. The fear of miscalculating. The fear of the consequences. And she did it anyway. That is not a small thing. That is one of the most courageous acts a human being can perform. And I say that having watched people do courageous things in situations that most people will never face. The driver called 911. I cannot overstate how important that single decision was. Not everyone would make it. Some people look at a note on a pizza box and think it's a prank. Some people are afraid of getting involved. Some people just don't want the hassle. This driver made the call. Law enforcement responded. And when they arrived at that address, they found exactly what the note had said they would find. The investigation that follows in cases like this is as much about documenting the full scope of the captivity as it is about the criminal prosecution. And that documentation process is brutal because every piece of evidence is also a piece of her story. The investigators who work these scenes, I've worked similar scenes, walk through the physical space and have to reconstruct from the material evidence what a human life looked like inside four walls for over a decade. What did she eat? What was she allowed to do? Was there light, ventilation? How was she restrained, physically, psychologically, or both? These are not just legal questions. They are questions about what a person endured and survived. and answering them completely is part of the obligation we owe to someone who survived something like this. Their full experience deserves to be on the record. The perpetrator in this type of case typically presents a very specific profile when investigators start digging into his background. There is almost always a prior history of controlling behavior in relationships. There are almost always people in his life who saw warning signs and either didn't recognize them for what they were or didn't feel empowered to report them. There are almost always records, restraining orders, domestic disturbance calls, complaints that were filed and then dropped, that paint a picture of escalating coercive behavior over many years before the captivity began. I spent a portion of my career specifically looking at what I call the trail before the crime, because in the overwhelming majority of cases involving long-term captivity, the person who did it left traces. They had a pattern, and if we had connected those traces at the right time, someone might have been protected before the worst happened. That is something that keeps me up at night. Not the cases we solved, the cases where the trail was there and we missed it, or didn't have the tools or the resources to follow it. What happens to survivors after cases like this is its own long story. The psychological aftermath of 11 years of captivity is not something that resolves in weeks or months. The brain that adapted to survive inside that environment now has to adapt all over again to exist outside it. Things that the rest of us take for granted, making your own choices about food, about what time to go to sleep, about whether to step outside, can be profoundly disorienting. The nervous system that spent 11 years in high alert mode does not simply switch off because the physical threat is gone. The support infrastructure for survivors of long-term captivity is better now than it was 20 or 30 years ago, but it is still nowhere near adequate for what these individuals need. Specialized trauma therapy, patient legal advocacy, financial support, housing, time. These are the things that make the difference between survival and genuine recovery, and they are still too difficult to access for too many people. Here is what I want you to take from this story, because I don't tell it just so you can be shocked or sad or outraged, though those are reasonable responses. I tell it because it contains real information that is worth carrying with you. Long-term captivity is almost never invisible to everyone. There are almost always people, neighbors, delivery personnel, maintenance workers, who have contact with the residents where something is wrong. They may not be able to name what's wrong. They may have a feeling they can't articulate. They may notice something small, a curtain that never moves, a person they've glimpsed who looks frightened, a level of control and secrecy around a house that seems excessive. These are signals. They are worth taking seriously. They are worth reporting. The pizza delivery driver in this case is a reminder of something that gets lost in how we talk about crime. We talk about investigators, about police, about prosecutors, and all of those people matter. But sometimes the person who saves a life is someone doing an ordinary job on an ordinary day who gets handed a piece of cardboard with a plea for help written on it and decides to do the right thing. He made a phone call. That phone call ended 11 years of captivity. I've seen what the wrong call or no call costs. I've worked the cases where the signal was there and no one acted on it, or they acted too late. The driver's decision matters more than he may ever fully understand, and it is a decision that anyone in any civilian job can make. It doesn't require training. It requires paying attention and being willing to act. If you want to be useful in a world where cases like this exist, and they do exist in this country, in communities that look quiet and normal from the outside, then the most important thing you can do is be the person who takes the feeling seriously, who doesn't dismiss the thing that feels wrong just because it's inconvenient to investigate, who knows the number to call and calls it. If anything I've said in this episode has made you think of something or someone, a situation that felt off, a person who seemed isolated, a place that gave you a bad feeling, I'm asking you to take that seriously. You don't have to investigate it yourself. You don't have to be certain. You make the call. You let the people whose job it is to investigate do that work, but you have to make the call. You've been listening to this long enough that I know you're serious about this topic. So I want to give you something practical. The National Human Trafficking Hotline is 1-888-373-7888. And they handle not just trafficking cases, but any situation involving potential captivity or coercive control. The text number is 233-733. If you see something, those are the people to contact. Before I go further, I need to say this. If you found value in what we do here, the most powerful thing you can do is subscribe. It keeps this work going. And leave a comment. Tell me what you think. Tell me what cases you want to hear about. I read them, every one of them. Now let's finish this. The question I get asked most often in the work I did and the conversations I have now is some version of, how do people survive? How does a human being endure 11 years of what Sarah endured and come out the other side still able to write a note, still able to think clearly enough to execute an escape, still able to believe that help might be possible? I have thought about this for a long time. And what I keep coming back to is this. The human will to survive is more durable than almost anything we can throw at it. It can be suppressed. It can be redirected. It can be driven so deep underground that it's invisible from the surface, but it doesn't extinguish. Not in most people. Not when it matters most. Sarah's note was not a spontaneous act. It was the product of years of internal survival. Years of watching, planning, waiting, hoping, and keeping a small protected part of herself intact and operational, even when everything around her was designed to destroy it. That small part is what wrote the note. That small part is what handed it to a stranger. That small part is what 11 years of captivity could not reach. The man who held her will face the legal consequences of what he did. I have sat across from enough of them to have no illusions about what they are or what they deserve. The law exists for exactly this, and whatever those consequences are, they do not come close to accounting for 11 years of a person's life. What comes closer, not to accounting for it, but to honoring it, is telling the story right. Not as a spectacle, not as a headline, as a real account of what captivity is, how it works, what it does to a person, and what it takes to survive it and escape it. Sarah survived. She made it out. She is one of the people who got to the other side. Not everyone does. For the ones who didn't, we tell their stories too, carefully, with the respect they are owed. 30 years of this work has taught me that the cases that matter most are not always the ones with the most dramatic resolution. Sometimes the most important thing is understanding how something happened, not so we can be horrified, but so we can recognize it earlier next time. So we can be the driver who reads the note and makes the call. So we can be the neighbor who reports the feeling. So we can be the person who builds a system that takes these signals seriously before they become cases. That is why I'm still talking about this. That is why, even retired, I can't fully step away, because the work isn't finished. It doesn't finish when one person escapes. It finishes when enough of us understand what we're looking at that the next person doesn't have to write a note on a pizza box to be heard. Until that day, we keep going.